At Iconium, Paul and Barnabas went as usual into the Jewish synagogue. There they spoke so effectively that a great number of Jews and Gentiles believed. But the Jews who refused to believe stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brothers. So Paul and Barnabas spent considerable time there, speaking boldly for the Lord, who confirmed the message of his grace by enabling them to do miraculous signs and wonders. The people of the city were divided. Some sided with the Jews, others with the apostles. There was a plot afoot among the Gentiles and Jews, together with their leaders, to ill-treat them and stone them. But they found out about it and fled to Lycaonian cities of Lystra and Derbe and to the surrounding country, where they continued to preach the good news. In Lystra there sat a man crippled in his feet, who was lame from birth and had never walked. He listened to Paul as he was speaking. Paul looked directly at him and saw that he had faith to be healed, and called out, "Stand up on your feet." At that, the man jumped up and began to walk. When the crowd saw what Paul had done, they shouted in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down to us in human form." Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul they called Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. The priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought bulls and wreaths to the city gates because he and the crowd wanted to offer sacrifices to them. But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of this, they tore their clothes and rushed out into the crowd, shouting, "Men, why are you doing this? We too are only men, human like you. We are bringing you good news, telling you to turn from these worthless things to the living God, who made heaven and earth and sea and everything in them. In the past, he let all the nations go their own way, yet he has not left himself without testimony. He has shown kindness by giving you rain from heaven and crops in their seasons. He provides you with plenty of food and fills your hearts with joy." Even with these words, they had difficulty keeping the crowd from sacrificing to them. Then some Jews came from Antioch and Iconium and won the crowd over. They stoned Paul and dragged him outside the city, thinking he was dead. But after the disciples had gathered round him, he got up and went back into the city. The next day, he and Barnabas left for Derbe.
Excellent. Thank you, Mickey. I'm aware this is the second time we've been in Acts 14, and we'll be there again next week as well, because there's so much to draw out. I sometimes wonder if we know what we've got. I was reading this week, in 1799, a man named Conrad Reed was fishing, and he discovered a very unusual rock at the side of the pool he was fishing. And it was 17 pounds in weight, but he thought, I'll just take it home. So he showed the family, and everyone thought it was a very nice rock, but they didn't know what it was, so they used it as a doorstop. Well, in 1802, his father, John Reed, decided to take this to a jeweller to identify what the rock was. And it turned out to be a piece of gold that was the largest of the nuggets found east of the Rockies. And he got paid. It was worth $3,600 in 1802. Just think how much that would be worth today. So you can go digging this afternoon. Okay. But until its composition was determined, its value was unknown, and so it was just used as a doorstop. And so it is with the composition of our faith. It needs to be determined. Its strength is unknown. God allows our ups and downs in our lives not to hurt us, but to strengthen us and prove the quality of who we are and what we have. And we don't even realize it's there. So sometimes I think we just park our gifts and everything at the door and use them as a doorstop and don't realize just how much God can do. And you know, one of the main issues facing the church today is that we just don't know what we've got by way of treasure. If we did, then all the issues in life we face, our personal business, our relationships, our work life, our church life, well, that would all be in balance, wouldn't it? And all be in perspective. And those things that dominate our thinking, all the priorities that we have, that we place so carefully, will be revealed as actually quite fleeting and in the scheme of things of little value at all. Now, no one is saying for a minute that we shouldn't make the effort to be good stewards of what we have and of who we associate with. It's just that far too often the gift of God, that is our salvation, and the power of the Holy Spirit is used as a doorstop while we get on with what we perceive to be the important things of God. So our first heading this morning is power to be. Now, the liberty of the church and the disciples here in the book of Acts is really exciting as we read back on events that actually happened. But I find that often it's almost tinged with a little bit of sadness because everyone says, well, it's great that it happened, but it's not happening now. Why is it not happening now? Well, over the years, the church has tried many things, has designed many courses and things to do. I'll give you an example. We did one called Evangelism Explosion. Did you ever do that? 17-week course, brilliant course, and everyone enjoyed it. There were practical exercises in it, weren't there? And so you went to a warm contact. So at the end of the course, it was arranged for you to go to folk who were really friendly, and you could go and share your faith and practice your course. And then you were taken to what we call cold contacts, these people who were interested but, weren't quite sure, and they would ask the awkward questions. Then there was a course called Master Life. Do you remember Master Life? Or if you finished Master Life, you got a pin badge for your jacket as well. So that was worth doing. I didn't actually get to do that. I wasn't classed as good enough for that one. But that was a good course. Then we got Life and Growth, which we are still using today, aren't we? Life, and that's quite a good course. And then excellent in content, statistically very effective. And more often recently, in recent years, last 20 odd years now, must be more than that, Alpha. Alpha's been fantastic, well thought out, well proven, and the follow-on material, it's actually proven itself time and time again. Then we got things like Christianity Explored. We all know what that is, don't we? Another good, wholesome tool that we used. And then there's the different styles of church that we brought in. We had the Willow Creek seeker-friendly services. Do you remember that? There was a big thing about that. And then we had Saddleback, and they produced books, 40 Days of Everything, wasn't it, for the Christian obsessive compulsives. Okay, and then there's been various people group type churches. They've got this narrow focus on social groups and actually a group of people in a community. And some churches, next slide, John. Some churches have developed different style services, so creating a sort of spiritual smorgasbord, and so folk can pick and choose that which they're comfortable with. But this is really just feeding our society's consumerist hunger and not offering a structured discipleship that equips the church for the realities of service. And whilst all these have their place, they all have the same thing in common, and that is the physical results that we can see. And what I want us to remember is that these things, these methods have been created and developed honourably to grant focus to the church, to regain the excitement of gospel, to bring folk in, and there's nothing wrong with that. But consider this. If we've got a box of electrical tools that deliver, but we don't plug them in, they're just a box of tools. What we need is a release of power into the church. And that's exactly what happened in Acts chapter 14 as Paul arrives and sees this man who's been lame, and he says to him, "Get up!" And I was quite thrilled the way you read that, Miggy, because actually it made me feel that I wanted to get up. There was a word of authority in there, wasn't there? How many of us have heard that voice? Get up! and we don't get up. We just say, well, maybe later. I've got too many things to do. And in verse 11 it says, when the crowd saw what Paul had done, they shouted in the Lycaonian language, the gods have come down to us in human form. Now, I've never heard that after a discipleship course or a seeker-friendly service. So that's power to be. Secondly, the power to the people. You know, people are fickle. They will follow the crowd, and it could be the latest fashion, it could be the latest hairstyle, the latest car, holiday, whatever it might be. And everything folk do, particularly in our society, is done to create an impression. Just take a look at social media. The pictures that we put up on social media are there to show what we think is our best side. Now, I know I've done that in the past, but then with ears like mine, I'm kidding no one, am I? The clothes we wear, the makeup we use, the car we drive, the motorcycle we ride, everything is designed to make us feel better about ourselves as we project that preferred image. And Mary and I watched a program a while back on TV about plastic surgery that had gone wrong. Have you ever watched those sort of programs? Oh, they're horrific, aren't they? And, you know, some, sadly, had such shocking results, they've ended up with psychological issues. But there was one girl, and she had her eyebrows done, and it all gone bad. So they found this surgeon for her, and he says, all right, I can sort it out. And he did, and she was really happy that all the damage had been undone. And she said a very interesting thing. She said, I'm just happy with the way that I am. And I thought to myself, isn't that where we're meant to be? You know, Paul and Barnabas, they had an opportunity here in Acts 14. They had this opportunity to realize their dream. They could have gone along with what these people were saying. They could have gone along and let them do the sacrifices and everything else. They could have waited then for things to calm down a bit, and then they could have educated these people properly. There were options and there were strategies they could have developed, and their services, there would have been a pack out. But, and I'm going to read this to you in the Message, verses 14 and 15. When Barnabas and Paul finally realized what was going on, they stopped them, waving their arms. They interrupted the parade, calling out, what do you think you're doing? We're not gods, we are men just like you. And we're here to bring you the message, to persuade you to abandon these silly God superstitions and embrace God himself, the living God. We don't make God, he makes us. And all of this, sky, earth, sea, and everything in them. You see, bursting the bubble of euphoria, this was a risky thing to do. And it's interesting that in one move, he brought the gods Zeus and Hermes down to a human level. He exposed the idea that the suggestion of their divinity was actually folly. And in their explanation, they point out that behind creation, there is only one living God. There's not this multitude of powerless and disparate and divided pagan deities or idols. The appeals to their sense of logic, and they're pointing out to them that if they really observe nature, they would realize that it's not controlled by this conglomerate of separate powers. Everything you see in the pagan system has a god. There was a god of water. There was a god of trees. There was a god of rocks. Even the processes of the body had gods. So there were gods for the god of speech. There was a god of sex. There was a god of life. And all these gods, like people, were in competition with one another. So what the apostles are actually saying to these people in reality is, get a grip. Message again. We are just men like you. And we're here to bring you the message to persuade you to abandon these silly God superstitions and embrace God himself, the living God. We don't make God, he makes us. And all of this, sky, earth, sea, and everything in them. This was a foreign language to these people, but they're beginning to understand where the source of power is coming from. Where there was power to be, there was power to the people, and thirdly, it was about waking the sleeping. These folks were living in ignorance of the truth of God. They followed the tradition of their society. They'd accepted the teaching as truth. And what they did then was fitted that truth around their lives. And don't we do exactly the same? There was no power. There was no living presence. There was only a set of stories by which they could justify everything. This is so current, it is shocking. By ignoring the presence of God, the power of God, and the direction of God, we drift in life's current, and our faith becomes an empty kind of fatalism that absolves ourselves from responsibilities of decisions and accepts the credit when things go well and blames God when it all goes pear-shaped. You know, we've got such a high opinion of ourselves, haven't we? I was reading a quote that was written to dog owners, and it said this: "Don't accept your dog's admiration as conclusive evidence that you are wonderful." Although your dog makes you feel good because they never complain, do they? They're always wagging their tail. My one is. By nature, we are all earthbound. Paul and Barnabas are saying that we are much more than the sum total of our parts. We belong to the one God who has created everything, and he holds it all in harmony. In the generation before us, says the message, God let all the different nations go to their way. But even then, he didn't leave them without a clue. For he made good creation, poured down rain and gave bumper crops. When your bellies were full and your hearts were happy, there was evidence of good beyond your doing. Talking fast and hard like this, they prevented them from carrying out the sacrifice that would have honored them as gods, but just barely. It was an urgent time. Those people, you try to argue against the crowd. It's not an easy thing to do. And notice that they're straight with these folk, showing them that there's one God and that he is truth, but at the same time showing them that their position cannot be blamed on fate. What they're actually doing is taking their shackles off and showing them freedom. But the problem we've got is that we like the shackles. And I have this picture in my head of so many Christians who have had their shackles taken off, and then they sit down next to the wall saying, what do we do next? And yet the gate is open. Everyone has a choice, and the evidence is there for the world to see. And their statement immediately cuts to the chase. It exposes the arguments that they would use, and folk use exactly the same approach today. They argue that if God permits free choice, well, then he permits evil to exist as well. So the question is, well, why is there evil in the world? And the humanist's favourite, if God is a loving God, why does he permit suffering and injustice and war? Well, look at verse 16. In the past, he let nations go their own way, yet he has not left himself without testimony. He has shown kindness by giving you rain from heaven and crops in their season. He provides you with plenty of food and fills your hearts with joy. Well, how's that an answer? Well, these questions are still asked over and over and over again. And the answer from the Bible is clear. God can end everything that is wrong with the world in an instant. But if that was going to happen, then our liberty for free choice would be gone. And part of the dignity of being human is the freedom we have to choose between serving ourselves and serving the Lord. That choice is a gift from God that he will not take away. But we have to make choices in life, to commit to things. You know the story of Luciano Pavarotti, brilliant singer. In fact, on BBC iPlayer, I've got one of the ones when he is in one of the big parks. I think it was Hyde Park in London, and they actually had towards the end of his life, he did a concert. Fantastic, well worth a watch. I'll tell you how old that is. Princess Diana and Charles had just got engaged. So that's how old it was. But it was a really good, and that sort of music is ageless anyway, isn't it? And he said, when I was a boy, my father was a baker, and he introduced me to the wonders of song. And he urged me to work very hard to develop my voice. So they found a man called Arrigo Polo, who was a professional tenor in his hometown. And he took him on as a pupil. But at the same time, to cover himself, he went and enrolled in teacher training. On graduating from teacher training college, he said to his father, what should I be? Should I be a teacher or a singer? And his father said a very interesting, he said, Luciano, if you try to sit on two chairs, you will fall between them. For life, you must choose one chair. So he says, I chose one. It took 7 years of study and frustration before I made my first professional appearance. I didn't know that. It took another 7 years to reach the Metropolitan Opera. And now I think that whether it's laying bricks, writing a book, whatever we choose, we should give ourselves to it. Commitment is the key. Choose one chair. It's comforting to know, isn't it, that God is sovereign, that he allows these freedoms. But he doesn't allow the consequences of our bad choices to run off unchecked. That is grace and that is mercy. Nonetheless, there are consequences, and sometimes we as believers are left scratching our heads. And Paul and Barnabas and the other disciples could be forgiven for doing exactly the same when the enemy let loose with a serious counterattack. They moved in that short space of time from a miracle to the adulation of being gods to violence. That's an incredible transition, isn't it? Then some Jews, verse 19, came from Antioch and Iconium. They'd already promised that they wanted to do this. And they won the crowd over. They stoned Paul and dragged him outside the city, thinking he was dead. But after the disciples had gathered round him, he got up and went back into the city. The next day, he and Barnabas left for Derbe. Now, I'd love to unpick that verse. What actually happened? Was he nearly dead? And did they perform healing? Was there a miracle going on? I'd love to, but we haven't got time to unpick that just now. You see, this is what happens when the power of the gospel is unleashed. And this is a warning to us. It's a signpost for you and me. If we long for God to work and the power of God is unleashed, then there will be consequences. There will be counterattacks. Do you see how Satan just exposes himself by using the old violence trick and stirs folk up to stone the one bringing the message that would free them? You see, the teaching here is that we need to be open to the sight that only God can give us. Getting God into focus. It means thinking correctly about his character, thinking correctly about his sovereignty, thinking correctly about the salvation he gives us, about his love, about his Son, about his Spirit, and about his word. And it means that we have to think about our relationship with him and how we prioritize that in our life's experience. See, the problem we've all got, really, is that too often what we do is we take off our spiritual spectacles, so to speak. And everything we do and all the decisions that we make become blurred around the edges. You know, if I take my specs off, I can see you, but you're all kind of fuzzy around you. Actually, I think I'll just leave. No, but, you know, sometimes it's blurred around the edges, and sometimes there's no definition at all. The secret to knowing the reality of God's power is found in a real relationship that is rooted in the Scriptures, believing and imbibing its truth and breathing its life. Our treasure, is it a doorstop? Or is it a part of our life and our future? Well, the answers to our questions and our burdens, they're at our fingertips. All we've got to do is pick them up. And we'll continue next week. Shall we pray? We do thank you, Lord, for